All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Here's how our dissertation presentations and defenses work. And they're a little different now that we're Zooming online until the COVID virus is over. But what we'll do is I'll turn it over to Victor to do the presentation. The presentation is to be no more than 30 minutes. And I'm asking everyone to hold your questions until after he finishes his presentation. And then we will take questions from the general audience. And we have several students on here from Dr. Sequat's 7000 class. So thank all of you for coming. Hopefully this is going to be a successful defense and you guys can see how we do things here at TSU in terms of the dissertation.
One sec, if you don't mind, I also don't want anyone to, I want to also acknowledge Dr. Sequat, I want to acknowledge Dr. Chilton, and I want to acknowledge all the students. So for all those that I missed on the screen here on the side, my apologies for a later acknowledgement. Thank you. And
No
now
problem.
I'll begin with the first question. Just kidding.
So, and what we will do is once we're finished with the general questions, we will ask the audience, they can go ahead and exit the Zoom and Victor will remain on the Zoom with the committee for further questions. And then once the committee has finished the questions with Victor, then we'll ask Victor to leave and I will deliberate with the committee. And Victor, I will be in touch with you later on in the day about what takes place, okay?
Okay.
All right, with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you, Victor, and you have the floor.
All right. Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Victor Ntembo. Today is the 22nd of March, 2021. Thank you very much for being here for this dissertation defense. We're going to be talking about the Advocacy Coalition framework. This is case study research, and the case study is the repeal of Tennessee's Hall income tax. This is the committee. Everybody's here: Dr. Stanley, Dr. Harris, Dr. Sequat, Dr. Chilton, and Dr. Robinson. Introduction. The first purpose of this study is to use the ACF, the Advocacy Coalition framework, to study the repeal of the Hall income tax. We're going to look at the assumptions and the hypothesis we are going to test the assumptions and some hypotheses of this framework. The second purpose is to identify advocacy coalitions that were in play in the repeal process and to see if they succeeded to cause policy change. Yes, there was the repeal of the tax, which is policy change, but were there other policy changes? Research questions. The first research question, and just so you know, I highlighted advocacy coalitions and policy change. That's going to be a recurring theme. Those are my two dependent variables. We're gonna talk about advocacy coalitions and policy change several times throughout this presentation. Research questions. The first research question is about advocacy coalitions. Did we have two or more advocacy coalitions? And were they active for a period of a decade or more as required by the ACF? The second research question has to do with policy change. Did we have policy change? And what factors contributed to this policy change? The ACF identifies 4 possible factors. It identifies internal shocks, external shocks, policy-oriented learning, and negotiated agreements. This is the ACF diagram. And the source for this is Jenkinson, Smith, and others from 2014. Just a little history here. The ACF was first proposed by Paul Sabatier in 1988. There have been several revisions of this framework. Jenkinson Smith with Weibel, with Nordstead, and a few others. And those revisions are based on criticisms and recommendations from these authors and other scholars that have used the framework. On the right, as you're facing this figure, on the right is the policy subsystem. The policy subsystem is the unit of analysis of the ACF. Each policy subsystem has between 2 and 5 advocacy coalitions. This diagram just shows 2, Coalition A and Coalition B. The members of an advocacy coalition are not just limited to the iron triangle. It's not just administrative agencies, legislative committees, and advocacy groups. It's more than that. It does include journalists, researchers, scholars, think tanks, and more stakeholders that are interested in that policy subsystem. What brings the members together is their policy beliefs. There are 3 types of there are 3 types of beliefs. There are core beliefs. So what brings them together is their beliefs, and there are 3 types of beliefs. There are core beliefs. Core beliefs are who we are, the things we learn as we grow up as children. Those are the hardest set of beliefs to change. Then there are secondary beliefs and there are policy beliefs. Policy beliefs, secondary beliefs and policy beliefs are easier to change. Resources. The resources of an advocacy coalition are not limited to money. They also include membership. They include the ability to mobilize troops. Advocacy coalition use their resources to develop strategies to convince government officials to make policy change to favor their policy beliefs. And so government officials are working within institutional rules to make policy, to produce policy outputs. And what are policy outputs? Policy outputs are the laws the laws or the rules that come out of these government institutions. The impact of these policy outputs is how these laws affect the community. Now, the policy subsystem does affect the external subsystem events. So, and that is that bottom arrow that goes from the right to you to the left. Those are external subsystem events. Activities in the policy subsystem, they can cause changes in socioeconomic conditions, changes in public opinion, changes in systemic governing coalitions, as well as changes in other policy subsystems. The 2 middle ones, 2 and 3, public opinion and subsystem governing coalitions, are going to play a key role in this particular study. Now, the changes in the external subsystem events can also come back and affect the policy subsystem, and we would see that in this study. On the top, top left are relatively stable parameters. These don't change. These change over a long period of time. For example, the Constitution, fundamental values, and social structure. These relatively stable parameters affect the policy subsystem through external subsystem events and through long-term coalition opportunity structures. Conceptual and operational definitions. So there we go again. Advocacy coalitions and policy change are on the top left. So those are the variables to your left. It's the left column. Those are the variables, and I'll talk each one of them. For advocacy coalitions, so again, advocacy coalitions are the groups or the individuals that come together to make policy change. And operationally, I'm looking at their beliefs, their resources, the strategies, and the amount of coordination between these groups to effect policy change. Now, what is policy change? Policy change reflects the beliefs of the winning coalition. And so there are major policy changes that involve core beliefs, changes in core beliefs. Then there are minor policy changes that might involve secondary or policy beliefs. Now, policy-oriented learning. Policy-oriented learning, policy-oriented learning can be within coalitions or across coalitions. This is learning about the policy, white papers, institutional, yes, it is just white papers. External shocks. Let me move on to external shocks. External shocks are major events that happen outside of the policy subsystem that have an impact inside the policy subsystem. So operationally, we're looking at changes in public opinion. We're looking at changes in the governing coalition. So those can have significant impacts inside the policy subsystem. Internal shocks. Internal shocks are major events that happen inside the policy subsystem. So internal shocks happen inside the policy subsystem. For example, when there is learning and people realize major failures in a policy, those are internal shocks. Negotiated agreements. So that has to do with alternate dispute resolution. This is when people might vote, like some government officials, for example, are convinced to vote for policy change, even though without changing their core policy or secondary beliefs. And that happened in this study, and we'll talk about that a little later. Data collection. So I had 4 sources of data: interviews, publications and documents, legislative bills, and newspapers. And I put some sources under there. Those are just examples. Those are just some articles from my literature review that use those same sources. Interviews are obviously very popular. Just for the record, 80% of, according to Weibel 2018, 80% of studies that were done with the ACF use qualitative methods, and interviews are very popular. For this study, I reached out to 15 personnel, to 15 people for interview. I talked to about 8 of them, no, to 7 of them. Some of them were by email. They answered my questions by email. And for some, we had long Zoom conversations that were semi-structured interviews. Then publications. The advocacy groups in real time published their beliefs about the whole income tax on their websites. And so that was very informative for this study. Then I had some documents, for example, from the Treasury Department, which was the agency responsible for implementing the whole income tax. Then there were a lot of legislative bills, about 148 of them that I got from the Capitol website, and it showed proposals from legislators to make changes on the bills. Some of them went through, only about 14 of those went through. Newspapers were very useful because they did help me identify members of these coalitions. They gave interviews, and newspapers captured them in real time and published them. And then I could go to their website and get all more information. My research tool here is content analysis. I did some coding, I did some themes. I mean, I identified some themes, and then I could draw conclusions. I tested a total of 6 hypotheses for this study. 5 of them were from the ACF, and 1 of them I wrote. Now, the beauty of the ACF is that you can use one of the ACF proposes 12 hypotheses. You could use 1, you could use 2, you could use none of them. So the first 2 on this page, the other 4 are on the next slide. The first 2 here are about advocacy coalitions. This first hypothesis, I'm trying to see if people shared if the coalitions were formed based on core beliefs. That was the first one that I tested. For the record, I'm just going to tell you what the outcomes were. I did confirm all the 6 hypotheses that I tested. The second one, the second hypothesis here was whether there were differences in secondary aspects of these beliefs, despite the fact that they share core values, core beliefs. The third hypothesis has to do with external shocks. And I wanted to see if there were major factors outside of the policy subsystem that caused, that impacted the actors that impacted policy change? The answer was yes, and I'll talk about that later when I'm talking about the findings of this study. Policy-oriented learning. There was a lot of learning within and across coalitions. Negotiated agreements. Yes, there were negotiated agreements. And now the sixth hypothesis had to do with internal shocks. This is the one that I wrote, reason being that the 12 ACF hypotheses, none of them directly addressed internal shocks. So what I did was take the operational definition of internal shocks and I replaced it in hypothesis 3. So I took the internal shock operational definition and I replaced the external shock definition in hypothesis 3 to create a sixth hypothesis for this study. And I could confirm, yes, there are internal shocks. There are focusing events that we'll talk about later. On this slide, what I did was take my findings and I went back to the Acf diagram and I superimposed the findings from my study to the Acf diagram. So this is the policy subsystem for the whole income tax. A brief background on the whole income tax. It was proposed by Senator Frank S. Hall of Dixon, Tennessee in 1929. That year, that law became, that tax became law. The interest rate, the tax rate at the time was 5%. Later on down the road, it became 6%, and it stayed 6% until 2016, when Governor Bill Haslam signed a law to reduce the tax. Now, I did identify two coalitions for this study. There was a pro-whole income tax repeal advocacy coalition, and then there's an anti-income tax repeal advocacy coalition. On the pro side, let me talk about the beliefs real fast. The main belief, the core belief there was freedom. The core belief was freedom. As a matter of fact, their campaigns were titled Freedom Together. Freedom Together. Now, other beliefs, this coalition believed that this tax is unfair to the elderly, this tax is unfair to businesses, and it needs to be repealed. They say it does discourage savings and investments, and it discourages people from retiring in the state. Resources. Their resources were not just financial. Now, the members of this coalition, which is just below, you can see the list of members. There are a lot of them. These are very well-funded groups. So they had a lot of financial resources. They had a lot of coordination between them, and they had a massive information campaign, a digital information campaign. That is one of their strategies. They had a massive digital information campaign that resulted in over 75,000 emails being written to lawmakers. Another one of their strategies is in addition to publications, they had scorecards, and I'll talk about scorecards real fast. The American Conservative Union Foundation, for example, has a scorecard where in 2016, they looked at 26 bills that passed through the Tennessee legislature. And each lawmaker, depending on their vote, they gave them a conservative score. And so that put them pressure, to get in line to be part of the conservative movement. Let's talk about the anti-whole income tax repeal advocacy coalition. They believe that they just wanted the status quo. They believe that Tennessee's tax burden is already low. They believe that it's okay to tax personal to tax privileges, which is what the whole income tax does. And Tennessee's tax structure is already very regressive, where the higher earning 2% pay about, the higher earning 1% pay about 2% in taxes, and then the bottom 10% pay about 10%. However, this coalition was not as strong. They were led by the governor. They were not as organized, and they were the losing coalition. Legislative action, I identified 148 bills from the Tennessee legislature over a 23-year period proposing changes to this tax. Policy outputs of those 148 bills, 14 became law. 13 of them were minor changes. 1 of them was a major change. And what was the policy outcome here? One of them was that the state, with the repeal of the tax, lost between $200 to $300 million a year in income. And then other jurisdictions had to add property taxes to cover the loss in whole income tax income. Now, this is the full ACF picture. So the last slide is supposed to be on your right, where it says policy subsystem. There are a few things that I will highlight here. The policy subsystem, on external system events, the mass campaign from the pro-whole income tax repeal advocacy coalition resulted in a strong opinion change in the members of the community. And that reflected in polls that were conducted before and after this study. Another thing that I will highlight on external subsystems is the fact that for the first time in 140 years, Tennessee became a red state. It became a red state with a majority in the general and in the General Assembly, both in the Senate and in the House. And that was an important external system event that provided the votes for the repeal of this tax. On the top left, where we talk about relatively stable parameters, I'll just highlight that there was a constitutional change in 1870, and that was what made it possible for this tax to be put in place in the first place in 1929, authorizing the state to tax privileges. They have tried to close that constitutional amendment to erase it, but it did not pass committee. These are the contributions of the members of the advocacy of both advocacy coalitions. If you look at the bottom of this screen to your right, it is the diagram key, and it's showing that everything in green are players from the pro-whole income tax repeal advocacy. The yellow is the anti-whole income tax repeal advocacy. So the yellow is the people that want the status quo. You can see there's not many of them. On your bottom left, when we talk about for the publications, you had all these foundations, the Tax Foundation, the Cato Foundation, all of those had publications on their website on the repeal of the whole income tax. And then there was only one publication there from the Institute of Taxation and Economic Policy, outlining several reasons why it's a bad idea to repeal this tax. Then you also had organizations on the ground actively lobbying lawmakers to repeal this tax. The Beacon Center, Americans for Tax Reform, even the Tax Foundation, they were all here. The Beacon Center hired a state policy network. These were not actually, these were just hired agencies. They were paid to do digital advertising, to convince the community. They had digital ads that focused mainly on, first of all, freedom, because opinion polls at the time showed that people wanted freedom. And so that was a belief that was exploited first, was freedom. And then after freedom, they proposed, they say, vote to repeal the whole income tax. It worked. The constituents supported it. They wrote a lot of letters. They put a lot of pressure on government officials, and the tax was repealed.
Victor, you got about 8 minutes to finish your presentation.
Okay. So themes and patterns. Well, what I'm going to highlight here on the left side, you have advocacy coalitions, you have the variables. So I have the belief, the resources, and the strategies. I already talked about them. I'm just going to highlight there that the pro-whole income tax repeal advocacy wanted, they wanted policy. They wanted freedom. They wanted policy change. The anti wanted the status quo. Policy change. The pro got some policy change. 14 of them. The anti was the losing coalition. They lost a lot. There was a lot of policy-oriented learning across and within coalitions on both sides. There's 2 more slides of themes. For external shocks, I've talked about the change in the governing coalition, and then also there was a focusing event. For external shocks, there was opinion pool. There were changes in public opinions, and then there was that there was the change in the majority. Internal shocks. This is the last slide of my themes and patterns. For internal shocks, there was a focusing event. And what happened is the campaign to repeal this tax, of the last 3 months before voting, it was very intensive. And that was a strategy that was used to change public opinion. And then they highlighted a lot of the failures, punishing the elderly and businesses, and negotiated agreements. For one of my interviews, one of the members talked about, he clearly identified himself as a member of the anti-hall income tax repeal advocacy, but he voted for the repeal of the tax due to negotiated agreements. Conclusions and recommendations. So yes, there was policy change, and that policy change was caused by the work of advocacy coalitions. In total, there were 14 policy changes. One of them major, 13 of them minor. Why is this study important? This study, the first one, in my opinion, is getting people to, on the record, to remember, to recount their story. 10 years from now, it would have been more cloudy. They would remember less. But this was a successful application of the ACF, and it's going to add to the literature. Policy implications. The law to repeal the hall income tax was passed in 2016 and was signed into law by Governor Bill Haslam. It was Public Chapter 1064. The next year, in 2017, the state had the state passed the Improve Act, and the Improve Act did what? It did increase gasoline taxes, increase diesel taxes, reduce food taxes, and then, for example, vehicle registrations, they only added it by $5, $10, $25, but it was expected to raise over $35 million. And then other states, the cities like Belmead, for example, added property taxes twice in 4 years during the phase out, just to cover for lost income from that they would have got from their shares of the hall income tax. Limitations of the study. Since it is a qualitative study, I believe that as the researcher, I try to be as unbiased as possible, but I'm very sorry about that. I try to be as unbiased as possible, but I knew that as a research agent, I was a factor. But selecting my hypothesis was, I think, was subjective. Selecting interviewees was subjective. I think if another researcher did it, they might not have got the same people that I interviewed. They might have got others. And then due to the restrictions of COVID, I didn't talk with anybody face to face. We did some Zoom interviews and then all the other documents. Recommendations for further research. I think that this study can also be conducted using quantitative methods, but you'd have to develop a good survey, use a Likert scale and stuff like that. Then you can use quantitative methods. I think that the ACF, it's a good theory. It needs to be used more in other studies. And this study can be conducted using multiple streams punctuated equilibrium, IAD framework, and other theories of the policy process. I believe that's my last slide. Pending your questions, this concludes my brief.
Right on time. Good job. All right, now we'll open the floor for questions from anyone in the audience. Anyone have a question for Victor?
Hello, this is Erica Light. I'm a doctoral student and I'm in Dr. Sequat's 7000 class. So he invited me to attend this dissertation defense. I'm wondering about, did you ask, when you were interviewing the people who were involved in these policy coalitions, did they say anything about whether they were satisfied with the ultimate outcome, not just with the policy change, but for example, you mentioned that districts or areas had to increase other taxes to make up for the loss of revenue from this tax. Did any of the people you interviewed mention this, and were they happy with that result?
Yes, thank you for that. The mayor of the city of Belmead, he increased taxes twice in 4 years, but he was very happy. He said that his argument to me was that the tax was on the whole income tax is unfair to the few people that pay, because it's only people that earn interest and dividends that pay the whole income tax. He said when he increases property taxes, he spreads the tax base and more people pay less. And so he thought it was fairer. So that was one. And then another lawmaker, the lawmaker that I spoke to, he really he didn't think that the whole income tax needed to be repealed. But he voted for it, and he said, "Oh well, I had to do it because we had lost the majority. The train was coming. I could not stop it." So he just gave up, and then he voted for it. But he said he was fine with the fact that there were other taxes that were put in place of the whole income tax, and the state was still able to pay their bills. So he was fine with it. He could live with his vote.
Okay,
Victor,
thank you.
Victor, just for everyone's benefit, talk a little bit about the people that refused to answer the questions and a little bit of behind all of that.
Well, okay. So I sent letters to 3 mayors. 2 of them responded, and they answered questions by email. The mayor of the city of Sladen, which had been identified in another study as relying heavily on the tax, she told me she has nobody else left. In 2004, Sladen was identified as a city that relied heavily on the whole income tax. She said, we have nobody else living in the state that pays the whole income tax, so we are good. We didn't lose anything. The 3rd mayor did not respond. I'll tell you who it was, the city mayor of Murfreesboro. Murfreesboro did not respond, but that's okay. And then I wrote to some lawmakers. I wrote to 7 lawmakers. One of them was Senator Overby. He is no longer a senator. He was under President Trump. He was the district attorney for Western Tennessee in Knoxville. And so he was restricted by DOJ policies to comment on state policy. So that's why he didn't respond. And then a few others did not respond to the emails, or others responded by others, some secretaries, for example. One of them was only a secretary that responded, but she gave me a lot of good information that I did not have, and I could only get through them. So at the end of the day, about 45% response rate, I was very satisfied with that.
The point I was trying to get Victor to mention is some of the higher ranking officials didn't want to answer the questions, but they directed their underlings to answer the questions for him. I thought that was an interesting point. Any other questions for Victor?
Yeah, I do have a question. This is Elizabeth Williams, and my questions are specific to the nature of the advocacy coalitions. So one question is, were the advocacy coalitions created specifically around this particular policy issue? That's one question. And then the other question was, did you consider the maturity of these advocacy coalitions? Because the pro sort of tax coalition, that coalition, I'm looking at the membership. So the Cato Foundation, other foundations are well-established foundations. So in terms of the maturity of those particular coalitions that have come together, I would assume that these coalitions did not just form in respect to this particular policy issue, but that they have galvanized around other policy issues. And if that is the case, did the maturity of the coalitions and their interactions with each other, did that in any way influence their abilities to be successful in being able to advocate for their particular policy positions? So there's sort of 2 questions about sort of the kind of dynamics of the policy coalitions and how they came together, and then the maturity of the organizations that are part of those coalitions. So thanks.
Awesome. So the first one is about the dynamics, right? Now, here is the thing. There was a poll that said, and they exploited this really great, was freedom. Just the concept of freedom, right? In their Freedom Together campaign, they explicitly said that freedom, like, it doesn't really apply to the whole income tax per se. Freedom is just, there was just a general poll that says the community does not, no, like the community believes that their freedoms are under attack by the government. And that just happened to be a uniting factor for this coalition. How did they come together? I'm glad you asked that, because there was a sequence. This coalition did not just form on this tax alone. In 2005, there was the repeal of the gift tax. In 2012, there was the repeal of the estate tax in Tennessee. So this coalition has been, they are working in more than one policy subsystem. But when I checked on legislative bills, attempts to repeal the whole income tax go back 23 years. So there are bills from the 100th to the 111th legislative session. They had made multiple different attempts to exempt certain demographics, to repeal. Heck, somebody actually proposed a bill to exempt musicians from the whole income tax. But others were more reasonable. They wanted to exempt the elderly. They wanted to exempt people, I don't know, over 100 years. Then later, people over 65. People with certain illnesses. So yes, this coalition goes further. Now, when you talked about maturity, you are very correct. There were national and there were local advocacy groups that have been fighting cases in different states for years. ALEC, for example, ALEC publishes Rich State, Poor State. They've been doing that for years. They highlight different policy changes in other states. Then one person that I interviewed is a policy advocate. She's been doing it for 17 years. She's been going from state to state, fighting different policies. Heck, she even works for some private organizations, as a lobbyist, trying to, get policy change for them. So that maturity was a factor. But in my opinion, the most powerful force that contributed to the repeal of this law was the change in the governing majority. In 2011, when the Republican Party took over, now the yam and the knife was in there. They could decide which laws to keep, which laws. They had to bring in their ideology. And that majority didn't just grow. It became a super majority. So they can pick what laws to keep and what laws to get rid of. And till today, throughout the phasing out of this law that started from 2016, the law just got repealed finally on the 1st of January, 2021. Throughout that time, they preserved their majority. So nobody could challenge the laws that they had set in motion. If that answers your question.
I'd just like to follow up on that, Victor. And I think the ACF is a very fruitful theory, and I'm excited to see you apply it to this tax. One of the things, this is like my one chance to ask this, which has been a matter of personal curiosity to me about the debate on this issue in the state for a while. In 2016 and 2017, Tennessee's legislature was awarded by CPAC to be the country's most conservative legislature. And I've often, which is around the time, but it's actually before the law finally got signed with the phase out. But my question is, Tennessee was a member of a very small club, which is the states that don't have personal income taxes. And there's maybe 7 of those states. But Tennessee's always had this asterisk next to it in that sort of list, which is very popular with folks that are anti-tax, and that would be conservative. And so I've always thought that the Hall tax must have been a thorn in the side of the legislature that they wanted to pull out because it's the last thing holding them back even despite the estate and gift taxes, those are categorized separately from income taxes. So this was our only income tax. And it actually becomes a way for individual policy actors to get a lot of acclaim from the conservative circuit. So like Representative Mark Green is a speaker at 2021 CPAC, and on his biography it lists, you know, he's responsible for the repeal of the hall tax, which is kind of an overstatement based on your presentation that one person would be. But I was curious, did any of the speakers talk about Tennessee's status as one of these states that, you know, almost doesn't have a personal income tax and that they wanted to get like fully into that club, or did they not mention that?
Well, Dr. Stribbs, thank you very much for this topic, because you kind of pushed me to it. and I'm so grateful for that. But yes, the first thing that I'm going to say is that the Beacon Center, for example, their publications had a lot on that topic about the whole income tax being the asterisk, you know, for the state, which would otherwise have been a tax-free state and had the benefits of the other 7 states, Washington State, Texas, Florida. And in their ads, it was a big deal. It's like they use football analogy to say like Tennessee versus Florida, and Florida wins because, and that was big. That is the ad that had 45 million views in a state that has 6.5 million people. They were highlighting the fact that it is just the whole income tax that is holding Tennessee back from being as getting the benefits of an income tax-free state like Florida and all the other ones. Now, one of the interviews was with, I'll say her name, Sue Zoldak, and she was one of those in charge of the digital advertising. Her argument, she kept bringing up the name, she brought up the name Elon Musk about 4 times. She said Elon Musk is leaving California and moving to Texas because Texas is a tax-free state, and said if she was doing that campaign now, she would have incorporated that into her campaign and said if only Tennessee did not have the whole income tax, they might have had Elon Musk move here, you know. So she brought that up multiple times. So yes, my documents show that, and interviewees said that as well. However, I will highlight though that the Institute for Taxation and Economic Policy strongly pushed back on that. They argued that Tennessee is already has a very low tax burden, the 8th lowest in the nation already, and does not need to repeal more taxes. They also argued that Tennessee's taxes are so regressive that the rich pay a very low percentage than the poor. When I asked Mrs. Zoldak that, she just said we didn't even think about regressivity, right? They just wanted the tax gun, and their arguments, everything that you just talked about, worked. And the last thing that I'll say is that the senator that I talked to was the House minority leader, and he said, this really stuck with me. He said that Senator Green pushed so hard for the repeal of this tax, he believes more for personal reasons, to get his conservative credentials up. I do have that on video, you know, and that matches what other authors in public administration state, that sometimes government officials work for personal motives.
Well, I'll just also commend you on getting these people to speak that candidly to you. It's not easy to get folks like that to even talk to you, much less, especially like a hired PR firm. I'm amazed that she would speak on this topic. So you were very persuasive.
I just got lucky, but she
Victor was very persistent in getting people to talk to him. Let's put it that way. Well, if there are no more questions, we'll go ahead and dismiss the audience. Thank you all for participating today. And we'll move to the stage for Victor. You meet with the committee members, okay?
Okay. Bye, everybody.
Thanks everyone for attending.
Thank you all so much.
All right. Well, good job with the presentation, Victor, and staying on target and getting through on time and so forth. And you did a good job answering those questions. Now, the committee's had a chance to really dig deep into the dissertation in terms of methods and protocols and findings and so forth. So we'll go ahead and begin. Now, I have worked with Victor now over the past year, and he's answered all of my questions that I have so far, but I'm going to help Victor take notes on any recommendations that might come from the committee. So I'll just open the floor for who would like to begin.
Yeah, I'll ask you a question. You mentioned in your presentation, Victor, that it was a 23-year period that there have been bills that have been out there and such. And then yet you talk about a shock to the system, a policy shock, or not a policy shock, but external shock. Is a 23-year timeline an external shock? I mean, they've been working on this a lot. And is it tied more to a larger national group of policy entrepreneurs who have the Grover Norquists and those types of folks who have been pushing for low taxes for a long time? And the second part of that is you keep talking about freedom, and that's a very generic concept to a lot of different people, and that was used as a marketing ploy. How do you kind of defaulted to that, to like, yeah, they said it was freedom, but is that really freedom or is that just marketing? Because I'm assuming if 98% of the public doesn't pay that tax, or 99%, that most people don't know what it is, what it does. So it's more marketing than any type of substantive policy concept. So those are my first two questions.
Okay. Well, as far as the 23-year period goes, what happened in around 1997 was difficulty balancing the state's budget. And so there was a need for tax reform. And so every year after that, there were bills trying to exempt certain demographics. So different bills exempting people. But that external shock comes in, like those changes that, like the other 13 changes that happened during that 23-year period were minor changes. They just exempted. They involved changes in secondary beliefs. None of them really, there was no success in completely repealing the tax over that time. And so it was this massive push, this last minute effort. As a matter of fact, Mrs. Zoldak said the last 3 months before that legislative session, that was when they did their most media activity to get popular support, right? So yes, it built up over 23 years, minor policy changes, and then it took that much time for the major policy change, which was the repeal, to happen. So things like negotiated agreements, learning, convinced members of the then majority to join the minority to vote for policy changes that were just on secondary beliefs. It was until the conservative movement took the majority that they could push forward with their core belief of that policy change. Now, when you talk about freedom, I could not agree with you more, because Justin Owen, the CEO for the Beacon Foundation, clearly stated that he learned this strategy from some campaigns in the 90s that had to do with plastic bags. So there was a very negative, negative feeling against plastic bags. And so they had to try to fight that. And they used something unrelated to plastic bags to win the public over. And then, and that's how they could fight that negative feeling. So what this movement did was use the concept of freedom, used the concept of the fact that opinion polls were saying that people are against freedoms. It was a marketing ploy, in my opinion. But it's a core belief as well. It is a core belief. They believe that freedoms are under attack. So they would do a 30-second ad that says, our freedoms are under attack. And then they would do a 20-second ad that says, right after that, that says, repeal the whole income tax. It doesn't look like it lines up, but they knew the effect of putting those two together. And that's how they got the outcome that they wanted.
And that leads to my, and I'll be quiet and let others talk after this one. Leads to my next, and I think you missed an opportunity, and you might be able to beef that up after this. Is the role of social media in terms of in the new, more aggressive, non-political actors at a national level. They're not new, but in states that have legislative majorities and control the entire trifecta of government. I think you could beef up the implications of, what happens when Wisconsin gets the same legislature and the same governor in Tennessee and Alabama, and the ability to steamroll policy under whatever marketing guise you want. So I think there's an opportunity to kind of add to the ACF literature in terms of digital marketing and its role.
Yeah, Ken, would you say a good question to answer would be, what was the role of social media on the impact of repealing the hall tax?
Yeah, because I know you had something in the conclusion. You had like one short paragraph mentioning Mark, but I think you could really beef that up and for either future research or discussing that.
Yeah, I think it's some of the things that he found that we could put a section in there with that question, and he could address that in the dissertation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chilton.
Any other questions from the committee?
I have one question, but first I want to say, you did a great job in your presentation. Secondly, I hope Dr. Harris mentioned he might be off when he got on because he has stuff he has to go, audits and other things he has to go to. So I'm just saying that. Okay, so Victor, one question I had is when it became clear, I mean, I know this was a long slog, but like when it became clear that it really was probably going to pass, was there a shifting in the coalitions? For especially the anti-repeal side, did other groups that necessarily didn't have this focus as this tax or this repeal really on their radar, but knowing the impact it could have on, for example, their constituents or who they serve, did it change and shift at all? And what kinds of discussion around that happened, if anything?
Wow, that's awesome. Well, I will approach that in two ways. The first thing that I'll talk about is I'll talk about Senator Doug Overby. In 2014, he was the one that he's a Republican that killed the bill to repeal the whole income tax in committee. He didn't think that the state was ready to pass this tax at the time. I was shocked that in 2016, he's one of the few Republicans that sat in the General Assembly. He was present and he did not vote. He did not change his vote. So that was one person that was consistent. He did not change. He was on the governor's side. That's the point. The governor, the Republican governor, did not want the tax passed. That's the second person that I'll talk about. The governor did not want the tax passed all the way to the end. He was basically the leader of the anti-whole income tax repeal advocacy. The Republican governor, Governor Bill Haslam. At the end of the day, Bill Haslam had a choice. After this bill had passed both houses, he could either vote, he could either veto the bill when he came to his desk. However, that bill would have gone back to the House and they needed just a simple majority to pass it. So he knew a veto wasn't going to help. So he could have signed the bill into law. That was his second option. Or he could have let the bill become law without signing. He deliberated for a few days, and at the end of the day, he signed the bill. So that was the shift. That's one shift. Governor Bill Haslam, at the end of the day, signed Public Chapter 1064, making the hauling sign, for putting the death nail on, repealing the whole income tax. So that was one shift. Now, when I look at who voted, because the problem that I have with answering your question in terms of all the other lawmakers is that there was no real vote before the final vote. So I have a list in one of my appendices of the votes of all lawmakers, all 33 in the Senate and all 99 in the House. I do have their votes, and I showed maybe there were 4 or 5 Republicans that voted against the tax, but there were several Democrats that voted for the tax, that voted for the repeal of the tax. So on both sides, they did cross over. Now, Senator, what's his name? The person that I interviewed, right? The House Minority Leader. He said that because everything was already lined up, he didn't even see a need to try to rally his members to try to stop the repeal of the tax. He said, so he basically shifted. He shifted and he voted for the tax. And even throughout the interview, he was trying to give me reasons why it was not a good idea. But he said he sleeps at night knowing that he voted for the repeal of the tax. He said, yes, there was pressure, but he said that what works most for lawmakers is not calls from the public. He said, when they know that you're going to primary them, they would line up, because some of these groups have a lot of money and some of these senators are not as wealthy. So when they are not as popular and you threaten to primary them, they will toe the line. And he said that to him was the most effective thing that the pro-whole income tax repeal advocacy coalition framework did, was threaten to primary people.
Okay, Victor, I just want to follow up on what you just said. The anti-repeal coalitions, did they try other strategies to try to, say, slow down the process? For example, arguing to defer the matter to the people in the form of a referendum. And if, because I think they had a strong case, given that the taxes, the lowest income population in the state pay the most in terms of percentage. Tennessee is one of the most regressive taxes in the country, 6 or 7. Right? Did they try to do that? And secondly, this is another question. Let me just squeeze in there. Don't you think it was already inevitable that this would be passed, given that the state had already turned red, regardless of what the other coalitions do? It was just a given thing that this law would be passed anyway, because one would argue that when the state was democratic, this would have happened either. So the fact that it turned red, there's no way you would stop this, regardless of perhaps even you would say that the other coalitions for it had perhaps limited impact, or the impact wouldn't matter anyway.
Well, to your first question is yes. The anti-whole income tax repeal coalition did make some efforts. Mind you that their leader was the governor. It was Governor Bill Haslam that did not want this tax repealed. So their main resource was not financial, but it was leadership. He had the bully pulpit of the governor's office. And so he granted a lot of interviews trying to convince the community why this tax was still needed. He was responsible for balancing the state's budget, and he didn't see how you could take away $200, $300 million and he would still be able to balance his budget. And so that's why he was fighting. And his fight was, you might want to consider other sources of income first before killing this one. So he pushed for that. He sent the treasurer, the controller of the Treasury, Justin Wilson. There's video of him in the House trying to give his opinion on the repeal of the tax. So he did try, but they did not do a mass media campaign like the pro-whole income tax repeal advocacy did. They did not have a lot of groups behind them. And to say it was inevitable, I don't think so. And the reason why I say that is because members of the Republican Party also have calculators. They know that that the state needs this money, right? And so even though they had the majority, there was a conservative majority, they realized that it was an internal fight. That's the way the House Minority Leader put it. He said it was an internal fight for their party to figure it out, right? And once they figured it out, then I will agree with you. It was inevitable once they figured it out. But it didn't just come that way because they got that majority in 2011. It wasn't until 2016 that they finally found a way. And one thing that they did to make this pass was to agree to phase out the tax versus just repeal it. Because when you phase it out, you give the city and local, the state and local governments time to balance their books. So they repealed the tax 1% at a time. They started at 6%. It was 6% in 2015. In 2016, it dropped to 5%. So cities can do their math and say, okay, I don't have enough money. Let me find another means to raise income a little bit. And then the next year, it went to 5%. Then it went to 4%. And then January 1st, 2021, it was 0%, and the law is gone. And by that time, all these cities had found ways to raise income, and they proposed income sources that had a broader base that was not considered punishment to everybody, to a small demographic. For example, adding vehicle registration fees, $5 for cars, $10 for SUVs, $25 for trucks. That brought in $35 million, but it's a broader base paid by a whole lot of people, not just people that invested in stocks and bonds. I don't know if that answers your question, Doug.
It does. My other part was a strategy like putting the question on a ballot so that everybody could vote, the citizens could decide on the matter. Was that tried or not?
The only thing that was tried in terms of voting was the constitutional change. Putting the matter on the ballot for citizens to decide if this tax was repealed is not required because it's not part of the Constitution. The only thing that was tried was when there was an attempt to repeal this, to get rid of the constitutional amendment from 1870 that authorized the state to tax privileges. Mind you, in 1870, there was that constitutional change that said you could tax privileges. And it was that 1870 amendment that made provision for the tax to be provided, to come in place in 1929. And it was challenged by the Supreme Court 3 times, and the law was upheld. So in 2018, Senator Kelsey proposed a bill to repeal, to remove that constitutional amendment so people should vote. It was supposed to go during the 2022 gubernatorial elections. That's when they were supposed to vote. However, it did not pass committee. In the initial vote in the Senate passed the constitutional amendment. But when it went to the House, it got killed in committee. So, and the House Minority Leader that I interviewed, he said he was very hostile to the idea that lawmakers today would want to take their beliefs and put them in the Constitution and tie the hands of future lawmakers. And so they fought very hard to make sure that it does not get to the full floor of the House, and it was killed in committee. And that's why that bill is not going to be in the 2022 gubernatorial elections for the community, for the Tennesseans to vote.
Thank you.
Anything else for Victor? All right, Victor.
I have one additional
Oh.
comment. All right. So coalitions drove this, made it happen, led to this policy change, just like they do on a number of other issues. What's the takeaway?
My biggest takeaway is that the ACF is actually a good replacement for the stages heuristics model. I know the stages heuristics model is a good model. It has its shortcomings. The ACF in its original form in 1988 also had its shortcomings. It's been criticized, and the authors have gone back and they have revised this framework over and over. And I think that with its current version, the current version guided my research so well. I was surprised at how things were just falling in place. When I found that data and I read into it a little bit, I could just position it, based on the guidance of this framework. And I thought it was a very good framework. And I think that a lot more research can be done to analyze the policy process. To me, that is the biggest takeaway from this research.
That needs to be in your conclusion.
Thank you.
All right, anything else?